Hi, and welcome everyone to the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. My name is Raphael Fizel. I am the Executive Director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. As always, before we start with the event proper, I'm just going to say a few words about how the Talking Animals series works for those of you who are joining us for the first time. After my short introduction, we will have a presentation that will last somewhere between 30 to 45 minutes. After that, I will be turning off the recording and we'll have around 40 minutes or so for a discussion. As always, everyone's warmly invited to participate in the discussion. So if you've got any questions for our speaker, any comments, please do come in the discussion. Can I please ask you to use the raise hand function if you want to come in? You can find that under the reactions button. If that's not possible for you, you can also use the chat box if it's easier. We are recording this event, as I mentioned, so if you want to watch it later or send it to a friend, you can find the recording on our website and on YouTube probably in a few days' time. Until the point of the discussion, I will have all the microphones muted. Okay, great. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker of today, and that's Paulina Siemieniec. Paulina, as some of you may already know, is currently a visiting researcher at the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. Paulina is a PhD candidate in the philosophy department at Queen's University in Canada, where she works under the supervision of Will Kymlicka. Paulina's PhD research applies disability theory and feminist care ethics to the political agency debate about animals. Her research interests are in exploring what it would mean to empower animals in and through the varied care relationships we share with animals as political agents. At Queen's, Paulina is also the coordinator of the Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics reading group, which some of you may know as APPLE. She also looks after the Work in Progress Animal Research Group there and the Disability Graduate Student Network. Paulina's research is heavily influenced and informed by her work as a volunteer caregiver at Sandy Pines Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. Today, Paulina will be presenting the paper that she's been working on here at Cambridge, entitled Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights for Domesticated Animals. Paulina, thanks a lot for being here with us today. Over to you.
Thank you, Raphael, for that introduction, and thank you everyone for coming today. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. So hi everyone, welcome. I hope everyone is well. The title and the thesis of my work today is on sexual and reproductive rights to health for domesticated animals. And this is part of a larger book project that I'm currently working on, which will also include non-domesticated animals, so wild animals. But I focus on domesticated animals here because, in my view, our relationship with them is arguably defined by sexual and reproductive violation. And as we will see, nothing in the existing literature amounts to an animal rights theory of sexuality and reproduction. And so that is the aim of my research. So the plan for today is to first look at how the issue of domesticated animals' sexuality and reproduction is currently discussed. Then we will look at the issue in international human rights law. And lastly, we're going to have a preview of my account of sexual reproductive health and rights for domesticated animals. So in animal ethics, we see two main ways in which the issue of domesticated animals' sexuality and reproduction is raised. So the first is health impacts of interventions. So one strand of animal ethics is concerned with evaluating the impact that different interventions have on an animal's health. For example, Claire Palmer's work is notorious for this. her articles ask, should we routinely neuter companion animals? Does breeding a bulldog harm it? Should we use non-surgical pharmacological methods to control the sexual behavior and reproduction of animals, and so forth? There are several problems with this approach. And to be brief, humans are uncritically positioned as the managers of domesticated animals' sexual reproduction. And on the other hand, there is no consideration of the individual interests and preferences of the animals involved. They only feature indirectly in these discussions because these are ethical evaluations of the human regulation of their fertility based on how specific interventions impact health. So these are assessments that are made objectively, removed from the individual subjects. And then we have another vein of animal ethics where the reproductive injustices that domesticated animals presently face are problematized. For instance, we find critiques of the exploitation of female animals and their reproductive capacities. And this is popular in the feminist tradition of animal ethics. So one example I have is Maria Torres' work, which asks why reproductive justice cannot stop at the species border. And overall, the limitation of these critiques is that they do not provide a positive account of sexual and reproductive rights. Now, moving on to animal rights theory. When we're talking about animal rights theory, what we're really talking about are different visions of what the world would look like if animals had rights. Animal rights theorists start from the premise that animals should be liberated from oppression and have their fundamental rights protected, but there are different conceptions of what justice requires of us in our future relationships with other animals. So overall, the issue of sexual reproduction does not feature as centrally as it should in the animal rights literature. And what I mean by this is that it tends to be mentioned in passing as a secondary concern in one of two ways. So animal rights theories either implicitly have consequences for the sexuality and reproduction of domesticated animals. So we see this in Francioni's abolition as extensionism, and there are recent revivals of this position. And B, they discuss the sexual reproduction of domesticated animals as an application of a theoretical proposal to that specific context. So we see that in Donaldson and Kimmelka's work, as well as Nussbaum's new book. So to be more concrete, legal scholar Gary Francioni argues that it is impossible for humans to have just relationships with domesticated animals, and so they should go extinct. Whereas political philosophers Donaldson and Kimmelka contend that we should at least attempt to have just relationships with domesticated animals by recognizing them as citizens of our societies. So Francioni's understanding of what I call abolition as extinction illustrates how the sexual reproduction of domesticated animals features indirectly as an implied consequence of an animal rights position. And while Donaldson and Kimmelka's work on animal citizenship demonstrates how the issue of sexual reproduction surfaces as an application of citizenship to the context of sexual reproduction. Donaldson and Kimmelka are on the same page as Gary Francioni about the need to abolish animal exploitation, but unlike Francioni, Donaldson and Kimmelka do not think that the abolition of animal exploitation would lead to the extinction of domesticated animals. They rightly reject Francioni's view as, quote, an abdication of our historical and ongoing responsibilities towards them, end quote. So for Donaldson and Kimmelka, the fact that humans have bred animals to be dependent on us indicates that we have now acquired positive obligations towards them. And domestication, they argue, is what makes, quote, co-citizenship both morally necessary and practically feasible, end quote. So what we essentially have here are two different understandings of how the sexual reproduction of domesticated animals should be managed in future animal rights world. And while it is true that, quote, the only reason they exist in the numbers that they do is because we intensively breed them to exploit them, end quote, I do not think that is necessarily means that we can assume that our role and our responsibility is to manage and control their fertility to ensure that their population sizes are socially and ecologically sustainable. I tend to agree on this point with Dinesh Wadawel that when he says the human prerogative to decide with respect to reproduction begins to resemble a more overt form of biopolitical sovereign regulation, end quote. So we certainly have a causal responsibility to remedy the past and present injustices because of how we are implicated in their present situation. The problem, however, with existing animal rights theories approaches is that the issue of sexuality and reproduction tends to be more about justifying restrictions on domesticated animal sexual reproduction rather than elaborating on what sexual and reproductive rights would concretely mean for domesticated animals and our relationships with them. So to make it clear, when it comes to the issue of domesticated animals' sexuality and reproduction, there are two main views. We have the elimination through sterilization, where, like I mentioned, Francione argues that the abolition of animal exploitation means that humans would not allow domesticated animals to breed, and that we'd have an obligation to sterilize them, so they would no longer exist. And then we have the overpopulation prevention or a one-child policy approach in Zoopolis, where Donaldson and Kimmelka, for example, argue that, quote, it is appropriate for us to control the overall numbers of domesticated animals as a reasonable element in a larger scheme of cooperation. And ultimately, they defend paternalistic restrictions on domesticated animals' fertility as part of a reciprocal citizenship model. So I do want to say that it's important to note that for Donaldson and Kimmelka's view, the sexual reproduction of domesticated animals is one area in which they explore what it would mean for us to relate to domesticated animals as citizens. So as citizens, domesticated animals would have the right to not have their sexual and reproductive activities unnecessarily interfered with. They would be regarded as agents in this area of their lives, and their interests in sexuality and reproduction would be taken seriously. However, Donaldson and Kimmelka suggest that the right to sexual reproduction would need to be constrained by their responsibility not to overburden humans by imposing, quote, unfair and unreasonable costs on us by having us take care of their offspring, which they say could become prohibitive. So Donaldson and Kimmelka explained that when domesticated animals prove to be unable to effectively regulate themselves with respect to sexual reproduction, humans have an obligation to act in their interests because citizens are part of a cooperative social project which involves a balancing of rights and duties. In other words, they claim that, quote, it is in the interest of domesticated animals that humans regulate their numbers in a sustainable fashion through relatively non-invasive ways, end quote, of controlling their reproduction rates that do not apparently infringe on bodily integrity by allowing domesticated animals a single chance to have a family before being sterilized or put on birth control. What this means is that A, they acknowledge the extent to which humans exert control over the sexual and reproductive lives of domesticated animals in deciding whether they can do it, how they do it, when, and with whom on their behalf. And B, they disapprove of systematically preventing domesticated animals from further reproducing altogether. But they still approach the issue of domesticated animal sexuality and reproduction by asking what, quote, regulation by humans of the sex life of domesticated animals is justified. My main criticism is that domesticated animals' sexuality and reproduction is currently approached by animal rights theorists as an issue of humans needing to manage their population sizes to prevent overpopulation in the future. Animal rights theorists seem to have one foot in the statement that domesticated animals should have sexual and reproductive rights, and another foot in the population control paradigm that restricts sexual and reproductive freedom because of the overriding emphasis on overpopulation prevention. The issue with this notion of population growth and management is that it does not respect individual interests or agency in sexual and reproductive decision-making processes. And it is based on the assumption that they won't be able to self-regulate their sexual reproduction, and so humans are justified in regulating their sexual reproduction for them. That is not to say that overpopulation is not a legitimate concern, but I argue that we nevertheless need an alternative rights-based approach that does not start from the question of what fertility restrictions are justified when it comes to domesticated animals. So my research seeks to move us and the discussion of domesticated animals' sexuality and reproduction beyond the confines of the population control paradigm by putting forth an account of sexual and reproductive rights to health for domesticated animals. And one way that I do this is by referring to how, in the human case, the sexual and reproductive right to health evolved out of a population growth control paradigm. And I think there are some really interesting parallels because how we used to think about human sexual reproduction during the pre-rights era of the population control paradigm before the 90s, and how we think about the issue of animal sexual reproduction now are very similar. In other words, in my paper, I argue that animals are stuck at the same juncture where humans were before sexual and reproductive health was understood as a fundamental right, and that a similar evolution should happen in animal case. And for this reason, I think it's worth considering why in the human case, the rights to sexual and reproductive health were severed from their original base in population policies and programs. So prior to the emergence of the rights to sexual and reproductive health, the issue of sexual reproduction was initially raised as a global population problem. So in the 1950s, 60s, there were alarmist calls to deal with the accelerating population growth rate because it was believed to be a main contributor to poverty, and it was viewed as a hindrance to social and economic development. So the issue of sexual reproduction was first introduced indirectly to the international agenda through a series of population growth conferences conveyed by the United Nations in Rome in 1954 and Belgrade 1965 and so forth. And overpopulation fears were reflected and expressed in an array of population policies seeking the reduction of total fertility. Most notably, this led to the creation of family planning programs that were directed at lowering birth rates and slowing population growth. These programs were essentially fertility control programs through their narrow and vertical concentration on fertility reduction. In other words, women were objectified in the population control paradigm as they were often regarded as factors and not actors in discussions about controlling their fertility. And unfortunately, in the absence of sexual and reproductive rights, these programs legitimize the use of coercive and discriminative practices that instrumentalize women's bodies to achieve this goal of capping population size. So some well-documented examples include material incentives for women to agree to undergo abortions or sterilization that impoverished populations simply could not afford to turn down, as well as the imposition of burdensome disincentives, so penalties for those who refuse to comply, such as withholding benefits or pay. The population control paradigm faced increasing criticism and was progressively abandoned on the grounds that it instrumentalized women's bodies to achieve population goals, and it failed to address structural issues and social inequality. And the policy agenda gradually began to veer away from the conventional focus on population concerns towards a more explicit human rights orientation. However, sexual and reproductive health was not officially recognized as a human rights issue until about the 1994 International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo. So the 1994 ICBT challenged the population growth paradigm through the introduction of a horizontal, holistic, gender-sensitive human rights approach to addressing sexual and reproductive health needs. It superseded the technical and vertical top-down view of population control as exclusively about fertility control and meeting demographic targets, which tended to accompany government interventions that contradicted the human rights of women, especially poor, multiply marginalized women. The human rights understanding of sexual and reproductive health delegitimized practices that sacrificed and violated human rights in the name of reaching demographic goals. As legal scholars note, the ICPT represented the golden age of sexual and reproductive health rights, in which the basic definitions were adopted and strong political commitments were made. And since the 1994, the ICPT was used as a framework. UN agency has been pushing states to adopt human rights approach to all programs, especially those relating to sexual reproductive health rights. So in short, there was, as Pizza Rosa notes, a paradigm shift from population control to human rights, from demographers' competence to governmental prerogative, from couples' rights to universal rights. And I will argue that this shift is relevant for domesticated animals as sexual and reproductive rights holders. After briefly explaining what sexual and reproductive rights to health are. So the right to sexual and reproductive health is encapsulated within the right to the highest attainable standard of health, which is enshrined in Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Though General Comment number 14 on the right to the highest attainable standard of health from 2000 mentions sexual and reproductive health, in 2016, the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights decided to issue a separate general comment on the sexual and reproductive right to health exclusively. So that's general comment number 22. So the right to sexual and reproductive health refers to a set of freedoms and entitlements. With regards to freedom, it concerns the freedom to make choices without violence, coercion, or discrimination when it comes to matters involving one's body and sexual and reproductive health. For example, individuals have the right to freely decide if they reproduce or have sex, when and how often. On the other hand, entitlements pertain to the enjoyment of the right to sexual and reproductive health, which requires the ability to have, quote, unhindered access to a whole range of health facilities, goods, services, and information, end quote. It is important to note here that sexual health is not the same as reproductive health, which is relevant for the animal case because there's a tendency to equate the two in the literature. And General Comment 22 distinguishes both of these aspects while acknowledging how close they are to one another. So it borrows the World Health Organization's definition of sexual health as, quote, a state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being in relation to sexuality. Additionally, the General Comment 22 endorses the ICPT Program of Action's understanding of reproductive health as, quote, the capability to reproduce and the freedom to make informed, free, and responsible decisions, end quote, and the ability to have access to a range of health information, goods, and services that enable individuals to make informed, free, and responsible decisions about their reproductive behavior. So the right to sexual and reproductive health, like the overall right to health, is not limited to the provision of healthcare, but it also includes underlying and social determinants of health. So they can be biological, genetic, environmental conditions, such as being free from torture and access to potable water, or they can be social determinants of health that are not necessarily medical conditions, but still impact health outcomes for better or worse, such as poverty, income inequality, discrimination, or marginalization. So what I hope the presentation illuminated so far is that the right to sexual and reproductive health is a historical creation and not a timeless given. And as such, I contend that it can inform how we move beyond the population control paradigm in the domesticated animal case towards an account of the fundamental right to sexual and reproductive health for them. In other words, this is a type of fundamental animal right that would be shared by human and non-human animals, but it would need to be differentiated according to the particularity of those involved. This obviously leads to a set of new questions, such as what would it mean concretely for domesticated animals to have sexual and reproductive rights? What would having sexual and reproductive rights mean to them? What would it mean for us in terms of changing how we relate and interact with them? These are the kinds of questions my research attempts to answer. So let's just briefly consider a few points. When we look at the definition of sexual health that the WHO provides, we can see that there's no real conceptual barrier to the inclusion of domesticated animals into this definition. So sexual health, the WHO writes, is a state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being in relation to sexuality. It is not merely the absence of disease, dysfunction, or infirmity. Sexual health requires positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, as well as the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. So this holistic approach to sexual health highlights, as I mentioned, the physical, emotional, and relational dimensions of sexuality, while simultaneously upholding the need for freedom and safety in sexual activity and relationships. So the sexual rights of individual animals would need to be respected, protected, and fulfilled in order for their sexual health to be attained and maintained. So the present situation of domesticated animals is that the vast majority of them are variously confined and kept in captivity, which physically limits their agency in addition to relationally mediated and imposed restrictions. So these restrictions on mobility have direct implications for the range of possible interactions and relationships domesticated animals can have, their frequency, quality, and the depth of these connections. Moreover, domesticated animals find themselves in an array of circumstances where many, if not all, aspects of their lives, including their sexuality, are determined on their behalf by the humans that own them. So part of the right to sexual health would therefore require mobility rights and the right to the freedom of association. Otherwise, their agency would continue to be significantly compromised. But in terms of logical priority, the sexual right to health for domesticated animals would first require the ability to have pleasurable and safe sexual experiences free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. In other words, domesticated animals would not only be free from this when it comes to sexuality and reproduction, that is coercion, discrimination, violence, but they would also need to be able to freely make choices about their sexuality and reproduction without the threat of coercion, discrimination, and violence. So the freedoms that come with the right to sexual health produce negative and positive responsibilities for humans. First, humans would not be able to interfere with domesticated animals' ability to enjoy pleasurable and safe sex lives. And a queer intersectional ecofeminist perspective illuminates that sexuality cannot be reduced to reproduction, as this erases the multiplicity of sexualities and the enormous diversity of gender expression in non-human animals. So we cannot know in advance what individual animals desire, what forms of sexual pleasure they will seek out, and it would be up for them to just discover this and explore this for themselves. To have sexual rights to health is to be free from violence, discrimination, and coercion, as I mentioned. So there would be a zero tolerance policy on the sexual violation of domesticated animals by humans. The only role humans would play in relation to the sexuality of domesticated animals is in co-bearing and enabling their agency in decision-making processes and ensuring that they are protected from sexual harm, whether that's humans or others. So the domesticated animals would also be entitled to enjoy the highest attainable standard of sexual and reproductive health and unhindered access to whatever they need to support the realization of this right. So as I mentioned before, reproductive health ties into sexual health in that it concerns the ability to determine one's reproductive life, which involves sexual reproduction. For domesticated animals, I argue that the reproductive right to health involves the right to have complete control of one's capacity to reproduce and freely decide if, when, and how often to do so. So where humans fit into this picture is that we would help to enhance and enlarge the ability of domesticated animals to make these kinds of decisions and to create enabling environments for the achievement of the right to sexual and reproductive health. So I'd like to flag that special considerations would need to be made in light of the fact that there will be a huge transition period from the present reality of mass and systemic sexual and reproductive violation of domesticated animals towards progressively realizing a higher and higher standard of sexual and reproductive health with the instantiation and adoption of their sexual and reproductive rights to health. This project is an attempt to denormalize and denaturalize the assumption that humans are the manager of domesticated animals' fertility and the controllers of their population sizes. It also, in many ways, counters the belief that humans are the rightful benefactors of domesticated animals' sexual and reproductive violations. So in my work, I also suggest that reproductive violation of domesticated animals occurs when individuals are prevented from cultivating or maintaining relationships, and these accompany defining experience for animals as relational beings, such as childhood, siblinghood, parenthood, partnerships, etc. The relational identity of individuals is typically fostered through the roles they take up and play out throughout the course of being alive. So reproductive rights for domesticated animals encompass the right to have a family, partnership, friendships, and any of these can take whatever form or style of relational membership an animal or animal group chooses. So for example, families do not need to be biological. The fluidity of this relational dimension to reproduction means that a family can be composed of homosexual couples that adopt children into their primary care, or these families can be interspecies and so forth. The basic idea that I'm proposing here is that the right to reproduction would drastically alter family dynamics and community formation for freely associating beings. And as agents in their relationality, domesticated animals would be free to determine their family and community life, and to what extent, if at all, that would include humans as their caregivers. So the right to reproduction encompasses the right to family, which protects family members from unlawful and arbitrary interference by humans. This can be found in Article 12 of the Human Rights Act, where the respect for private and family life includes, quote, the right to control who sees and touches your body, develop your personal identity, forge relationships and friendships, end quote. Domesticated animals would have the right to care for and have custody of their biological and foster children. And this, of course, would have to be in line with the best interests of the child in question. All that is to say is that sexual and reproductive rights to health for domesticated animals would necessarily require a radically different way of thinking about and relating to and interacting with these animals. So I just want to end off with this picture and say that on this account, sexual and reproductive rights to health would not operate in the interest of domesticated animals in the sense of humans deciding on behalf of them to determine what the best course of action is. Rather, these rights would protect domesticated animals' expressed and embodied interests in their sexual and reproductive lives. The presumption here is that domesticated animals are self-representatives because of their self-determination. So humans, and particularly human caregivers, would play a supporting role in relationally enabling and co-bearing the agency of domesticated animals in sexual and reproductive decision-making processes. And the question of whether sexual and reproductive health rights would lead to overpopulation is an empirical and a practical question, because we do not know what individual domesticated animals would choose to do with respect to having sexual reproductive freedom, given their personal histories and their individual agency. So it's really a question on the individual level, on the species level, and on group levels for domesticated animals. I think this then becomes more of a matter of how the duty of care would be distributed among humans when it comes to caring for dependent domesticated animals, as opposed to concentrating so heavily on preventing overpopulation. The question then, when it comes to legal obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the sexual and reproductive right to health, is not primarily how do we ensure that they do not overpopulate, or asking if controlling their fertility is justified. My research is more concentrated and concerned with what responsibilities are generated by the sexual reproductive rights for domesticated animals, and investigating whether and how it is possible for humans to relate to domesticated animals as sexual and reproductive health rights holders. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.